The White House's East Room stood silent as cameras flashed. Two men, one with carefully coiffed blonde hair, the other with a silver-gray mane, shook hands firmly before the world's media. Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu's expressions remained measured, revealing little of the high-stakes diplomacy about to unfold behind closed doors. "Prime Minister Netanyahu and I have much to discuss today," Trump announced, his voice echoing through the marble hall. "The situation in Gaza demands immediate attention. Together, we will find a path forward." Netanyahu nodded solemnly. "Mr. President, your invitation comes at a critical moment. What happens next may well determine the future of the entire Middle East." As the two leaders retreated to the Oval Office, political commentators worldwide launched into frenzied speculation. This wasn't just another diplomatic meeting. This was a convergence that could reshape geopolitical alliances across the Middle East. Hours later, in a small apartment in Brooklyn, Professor Daniel Levinson adjusted his glasses and turned down the television volume. The news had moved on to domestic issues, but his mind remained fixed on the summit. A respected scholar of biblical archaeology and Middle Eastern history, Levinson had spent decades studying ancient texts alongside modern conflicts. "Sarah," he called to his graduate assistant who was organizing research notes across his cluttered dining table. "What do you make of this meeting?" Sarah Winters looked up from her papers. At 28, her academic credentials were impeccable, though her perspective often differed from her mentors. Politically significant, obviously. Netanyahu needs U.S. backing now more than ever with the escalation in Gaza. Daniel shook his head slowly. "There's something more here. Have you revisited Ezekiel 38 recently?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "The prophecy about Gog and Magog? The invasion from the north?" She paused, immediately seeing where Daniel was headed. "You can't seriously think—" "I don't know what to think," Daniel interrupted, reaching for his well-worn Bible. "But certain patterns are impossible to ignore. Ezekiel describes a time when Israel has been brought back from the sword and its people gathered from many nations. The prophet speaks of an invasion led by nations from the remote parts of the north." Sarah crossed her arms. "Professor, with respect, scholars have been mapping current events onto biblical prophecy for centuries. The Soviet Union, Nazi Germany. Every generation thinks they're witnessing fulfillment." "Perhaps," Daniel conceded, "but consider the specific conditions Ezekiel describes. Israel as a restored nation, a relative peace before sudden conflict, multiple nations conspiring against her. Now look at today's headlines. Russia's growing influence in Syria, Iran's proxies in Gaza, Turkey's shifting allegiances." He turned to his computer and pulled up a satellite map of the region. "What's happening now isn't just another skirmish. The Gaza conflict has drawn in players from across the region, exactly as the ancient text suggests would happen before the latter days." Sarah remained skeptical but curious. "So you think Trump and Netanyahu meeting has prophetic significance?" "I think," Daniel replied carefully, "that we would be remiss as scholars not to at least examine the possibility. Trump's unconventional approach to Middle East policy, Netanyahu's determination to secure Israel's borders, their decisions in the coming days, could either diffuse tensions or accelerate a confluence of events that bears striking resemblance to Ezekiel's vision." The professor picked up a remote and switched to an international news channel showing live footage of protests erupting across multiple capitals. Signs in various languages denounced both Israel and America. In Moscow, Tehran, and Ankara, the rhetoric from government officials had grown increasingly hostile. "Look at this coordination," Daniel murmured. "The ancient text speaks of a great assembly that comes against Israel. Are we seeing the preliminary movements?" Sarah leaned forward despite her skepticism. "What exactly does the prophecy say happens next?" Daniel turned to the relevant passage. Ezekiel describes divine intervention, an earthquake, plague, flooding rain, great hailstones, fire and sulfur. The invading armies turn against each other in confusion. Natural disasters and military chaos? Sarah shrugged. That could describe many historical conflicts. "True," Daniel acknowledged, "but the specificity of the preceding conditions is what gives me pause. The prophecy states these events will make God's name known among the nations. It represents a turning point, not just for Israel, but for how the world understands divine involvement in human history." As night fell over New York City, the two scholars continued their debate, unaware that in Washington, the meeting between Trump and Netanyahu had already extended far beyond its scheduled conclusion. Whatever was being discussed in the Oval Office, one thing was certain: The world would feel its repercussions for years to come, and in the skies over the Middle East, storm clouds were gathering. The following morning, Daniel's lecture hall at Columbia University was unusually crowded. Word had spread that the renowned professor would be addressing potential connections between current events and biblical prophecy. Students and faculty from various departments filled the seats, drawn by either academic interest or simple curiosity. Ezekiel's prophecy, Daniel began, projecting ancient Hebrew text alongside its English translation, was written during the Babylonian exile, approximately 2,600 years ago. Yet its descriptions of a future conflict centered on a restored Israel have captivated scholars for generations. He clicked to the next slide, showing a map of modern Israel alongside territorial boundaries from different historical periods. The prophecy specifically mentions Gog, of the land of Magog, coming from the remote parts of the north. Historically, many scholars have identified this northern power with Russia, though interpretations vary widely. In the third row, Sarah noticed several students exchanging skeptical glances. She understood their hesitation. Academia generally approached prophetic literature as cultural artifacts rather than predictive texts. Daniel was treading dangerous waters professionally. Consider these words from Ezekiel, Daniel continued, highlighting a passage. In the latter years you will come into the land that is restored from the sword, whose inhabitants have been gathered from many nations to the mountains of Israel, which had been a continual waste. But its people were brought out from the nations, and they are living securely, all of them. He paused, allowing the words to resonate. Israel was re-established in 1948 after nearly 2 millennia of Jewish dispersion. Jews returned from over 100 countries, gathered, as the text says, from many nations. The land that had been largely barren under Ottoman rule became fertile again. These alignments with ancient text are, at minimum, remarkable historical parallels. A hand rose from the audience. Professor Levinson, couldn't this be confirmation bias? We're selecting elements that fit while ignoring discrepancies? Daniel nodded appreciatively. An excellent question. Critical analysis demands we consider alternative explanations. However, Ezekiel's prophecy contains 16 specific predictions about this future scenario. When multiple distinct elements align with current geopolitics, it at least warrants examination. He advanced to a slide showing recent newspaper headlines about the Gaza conflict, alongside quotes from Russian, Turkish, and Iranian officials criticizing Israel. Ezekiel mentions specific nations that ally against Israel: Persia, which is modern Iran; Gomer and Beth Togarmah, historically associated with regions in or near Turkey; Cush and Put, corresponding to regions in Africa. The prophecy describes many peoples with you, suggesting a coalition. Sarah watched, as even skeptical students began taking notes. Whatever one's theological position, the historical and geopolitical analysis was compelling. Now the meeting between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu, Daniel continued, showing yesterday's news footage. While we don't know exactly what was discussed, sources indicate it involved a major peace initiative for Gaza with broader regional implications. He clicked to another passage from Ezekiel. You will say, I will go up against the land of unwalled villages. I will go against those who are at rest, that live securely, all of them living without walls and having no bars or gates. Modern Israel, despite its security concerns, represents one of the most developed and economically prosperous nations in the Middle East. Yet it's surrounded by adversaries who regularly call for its destruction. The prophecy suggests that Israel will be living in a condition of perceived security when this coalition moves against it. After the lecture, a small group gathered around Daniel's podium with follow-up questions. Sarah noticed a man in a dark suit standing at the back of the hall, watching intently but never approaching. When she looked again moments later, he was gone. That evening, Daniel's phone rang as he was preparing dinner in his apartment. Professor Levinson, came an unfamiliar voice. My name is Michael Reeves, State Department. Your lecture today has generated significant interest in certain circles. Daniel set down his knife. I'm merely exploring historical parallels, Mr. Reeves. Nevertheless, we believe your insights could be valuable. A car will pick you up tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. Please bring your research materials regarding Ezekiel's prophecy and current Middle Eastern alliances. Before Daniel could respond, the line went dead. What was that about? Sarah asked, looking up from her laptop where she'd been monitoring social media reactions to their lecture. Daniel stared at the phone. It seems our academic exercise has caught the government's attention. Sarah closed her laptop. That can't be good. Or perhaps it's exactly what's needed, Daniel replied quietly. If these patterns are more than coincidence, then understanding them could be crucial in navigating what comes next. On her screen, a breaking news alert flashed. Massive explosions reported in Gaza as conflict escalates. Emergency UN Security Council session called as regional powers threaten intervention. The State Department building loomed against the morning sky as Daniel and Sarah were escorted through security checkpoints. Michael Reeves, a stern-faced man in his 50s, met them in a marble-floored lobby. Professor Levinson, Ms. Winters, thank you for coming. His tone suggested they'd had little choice. What you're about to hear is classified. You're here because your expertise has become unexpectedly relevant. They followed him into an elevator that required a keycard and fingerprint scan. When the doors opened, they entered a windowless conference room where 6 people sat around a polished table. At its head was a familiar face, Secretary of State Eleanor Chambers. Professor, she nodded curtly, your lecture yesterday on Ezekiel's prophecy reached us rather quickly. Daniel set down his briefcase. I'm surprised the State Department monitors biblical scholarship lectures. We don't, replied a gray-haired man who introduced himself only as Director Collins. But when a respected academic starts connecting ancient prophecies to a meeting between a former president and Israel's prime minister the day before major diplomatic announcements, it gets flagged. Secretary Chambers gestured to the empty chairs. Please sit. What we're about to discuss doesn't leave this room. As they settled, a technician activated a large screen, showing satellite imagery of troop movements. Chambers continued. Yesterday's meeting between Trump and Netanyahu finalized a proposed peace agreement that would permanently divide Gaza while guaranteeing Israel's security. The agreement includes significant concessions from both sides, Reeves elaborated. Israel would withdraw from certain areas, Palestinians would receive international guarantees of statehood, and regional powers would be economically incentivized to recognize Israel. Director Collins tapped his tablet, changing the display to show diplomatic communications. What concerns us is the reaction from Russia, Iran, Turkey, and several North African nations. Within hours of the announcement, we detected unusual military communications and asset deployments. Daniel leaned forward. Exactly the nations mentioned in Ezekiel 38. Collins nodded grimly. Hence your presence here today. This coalition is coordinating in ways we haven't seen before. Intelligence suggests they view this peace deal as an American-Israeli conspiracy to permanently alter the Middle East's balance of power. But why would biblical prophecy interest the State Department? Sarah asked. Chambers exchanged glances with her colleagues before responding. We're not theological experts, Ms. Winters, but we are pragmatists. If millions across the Middle East believe current events fulfill prophecy, it affects their behavior regardless of the prophecy's validity. Religious narratives drive action. And, Reeves added, if there's any chance these ancient texts contain insights into how these events might unfold, we'd be negligent not to examine them. Daniel opened his laptop. Ezekiel describes the invading coalition being ultimately defeated not by Israel's military might, but by what appears to be natural disasters, perhaps even divine intervention. I will call for a sword against him on all my mountains, it reads. Every man's sword will be against his brother. With pestilence and with blood I will enter into judgment with him, and I will rain on him and on his troops, and on the many peoples who are with him, a torrential rain, with hailstones, fire, and brimstone, meteorological warfare, nuclear exchange, Director Collins mused. The language is poetic but suggests massive devastation, Sarah interjected. The prophecy also indicates the invasion occurs when Israel is living securely. Despite regional tensions, can we say that's the case now? Before anyone could answer, a young analyst burst into the room. Madam Secretary, you need to see this. He connected his tablet to the main screen, displaying breaking news footage. A reporter stood on a rooftop in Jerusalem, the Temple Mount visible behind her. Moments ago, Prime Minister Netanyahu announced that following his meeting with former President Trump, Israel and Palestinian representatives have signed preliminary accords establishing what Netanyahu called a new era of security and prosperity. Regional response has been swift and hostile, with Iran's supreme leader calling it the final deception before liberation. Russian naval vessels have departed Syrian ports, and Turkish military units are reportedly conducting exercises near their southern border. The room fell silent. Finally, Chambers spoke. Professor Levinson, In your professional opinion, how closely do these developments align with the prophecy you've studied? Daniel took a deep breath. The parallels are remarkably precise. Ezekiel describes a time when Israel has returned from exile, when a coalition from the north and its allies move against it, seemingly triggered by a new status quo that threatens their interests. And the outcome? Collins asked. If we're truly witnessing prophetic fulfillment, Daniel replied carefully, then what comes next would be unexpected intervention, events so dramatic they would be interpreted as divine in nature. Chambers stood. We deal in diplomatic and military realities, not divine intervention. Our immediate concern is preventing a regional conflagration. You've given us valuable context, Professor, but now we need actionable intelligence. As if on cue, alarms began blaring throughout the building. The analyst's tablet lit up with urgent alerts. Madam Secretary, he reported, his voice tight, we're receiving reports of unusual seismic activity throughout the Middle East. Magnitude 6. 7 earthquake centered near Damascus, with aftershocks reported across Lebanon, Jordan, and northern Israel. On the screen, the news footage showed dust clouds rising from Jerusalem as buildings swayed. Daniel and Sarah exchanged stunned glances. Is this? Sarah began. I don't know, Daniel whispered. But Ezekiel did say, in that day there will be a great earthquake in the land of Israel. 3 days after the earthquake, Daniel stood at his apartment window overlooking a city gripped by eschatological fever. Street preachers had multiplied across New York, and houses of worship overflowed. The world had watched in stunned silence as natural disasters coincided precisely with military movements against Israel. The timing cannot be dismissed as coincidence, Daniel murmured as Sarah entered with 2 coffee mugs. The Russian naval vessels that were heading toward Israeli waters were hit by what meteorologists are calling a microburst storm of unprecedented intensity, she said, setting down his coffee. Turkish troops near the Syrian border reported mass illness, some kind of rapidly spreading respiratory infection that hospitalized thousands. Daniel nodded. And the reports from Iran of confusion in command structures leading to friendly fire incidents. On his television, international news showed footage of destroyed military equipment and bewildered soldiers retreating in disarray. The coalition that had seemed poised to escalate the Gaza conflict into a regional war was disintegrating amid inexplicable setbacks. Every man's sword against his brother, Sarah quoted softly. Daniel's phone rang. Michael Reeves again. Professor, we need you at the UN immediately. Secretary Chambers is addressing an emergency session of the Security Council. 90 minutes later, they sat in the gallery as Chambers approached the podium. The chamber buzzed with diplomatic activity. Representatives huddled in urgent consultation. Distinguished delegates, Chambers began, we face an extraordinary moment in international relations. The events of the past 72 hours defy conventional explanation. Whatever your religious or philosophical framework, we must acknowledge that the coordinated military action against Israel has been halted by what can only be described as remarkable circumstances. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. The Russian ambassador whispered intensely to an aide. The United States proposes an immediate multinational commission to oversee implementation of the peace accords negotiated with the assistance of former President Trump. These events have created a window for lasting stability. As diplomats debated, Daniel watched Netanyahu on a side monitor addressing his nation. The Israeli leader, looking exhausted but resolute, spoke words that sent chills down Daniel's spine. The nations have seen his hand, Netanyahu declared. As our prophets foretold, those who came against Jerusalem have been turned back not by our strength alone. We extend peace to our neighbors anew, knowing that ancient promises still guard modern Israel. Later, as Daniel and Sarah walked through the UN Plaza, a light snow began to fall on New York. Was it truly divine intervention? Sarah asked, her academic skepticism battling with what she had witnessed. Or just an extraordinary convergence of natural phenomena? Daniel watched snowflakes melt on his sleeve. Perhaps the distinction matters less than we think. Ezekiel's prophecy served its purpose either way. It prepared a people to recognize meaning in what others might see as random events. So was Trump and Netanyahu's meeting truly prophetic? I believe it was a catalyst, Daniel replied. Whether by divine design or historical momentum, their actions set in motion events that resonate with patterns established millennia ago. The prophecy speaks of aftermath too, a time of recognition and return to ancient truths. Sarah looked thoughtful. The text says God acts this way, so the nations will know that I am the Lord. Indeed, and now we all face the same question. Daniel gazed at the international flags fluttering against the gray sky. What will we do with this knowledge? As they walked toward the subway, news alerts chimed on phones around them. The peace accord was holding. Representatives from nations that had never recognized Israel were arriving in Jerusalem. Humanitarian aid flowed into Gaza. History and prophecy continue their dance, Daniel said quietly. We study ancient words not just to understand the past, but to recognize our moment when it arrives. Above them, the clouds parted, allowing a single shaft of sunlight to illuminate the United Nations building. A brief, golden moment amid the gathering winter.